Okay, I think let's get started. Hi everybody, thank you so much for coming to this first virtual panel on on how we can how open science practices can increase trust in research. We're thrilled to have you here. Also, just want to give a shout out. Thank you so much to the great folks at the Journalist Resource and the Shorenstein Center on Media Politics and Public Policy at the Harvard Kennedy School. They've helped put this together and host it and facilitate it, and it wouldn't be happening without them. Thank you so much. We're gonna do, oh yeah, so details are coming on in the chat, but just heads up, this is recorded. And so it'll be available later on the website. And as a result, we are gonna make this on the record if anyone here is a journalist who wants to use it. And of course, you can reach out to the panelists afterward if you want to continue the conversation, which we hope you do. So I'm going to give some very, very brief intros. Our full intros are on the website and you can read them there. First off, I'm Gabe Stein. I'm moderating the panel today. I'm a 2025 Joan Shorenstein Fellow here at the Shorenstein Center. I'm also the head of product and operations at Knowledge Futures. We're a nonprofit that's spun out of the MIT Media Lab and the MIT Press to build open academic publishing technology. And sort of before that, I was in science communication and have a digital media background. And we have an incredible panel here with us that spans sort of the full stack, as it were, of research communication from the lab all the way to the press. So we have Nidhi Bala, who's a professor of biology at UC Santa Cruz and the primary investigator of the Bala Lab and founder of it, I imagine. We have Richard Sever, who's the co-founder of the preprint servers bioRxiv and medRxiv, and also now the chief science and strategy officer at openRxiv, the nonprofit that runs them. And we have finally Rachel Zamzo, who is the deputy executive director of the Open Network. Thank you so much, or sorry, the Open Network. The Open Notebook, excuse me. Anyway, thank you so much for joining us. And we're going to get into it. I'm going to quickly introduce the topic and then do a very brief speed run of sort of the history of open science and what we're talking about to get us on the same page. And then we're going to dive into it. So the topic is basically as follows. Prior to the internet and the open science movement, the academic enterprise operated what we might call a parallel mass media system designed mostly for researchers to learn about and discuss new work with each other. And where it bubbled over into the public sphere, usually it was the news media sort of taking it over into that parallel network. And that was the primary way that those networks overlapped. But as open science, which we'll discuss what that is in just a second, has become more prevalent, particularly online, these once parallel systems are now overlapping on social media and mass media and other places in new and unpredictable ways. And there's been, of course, positive and negative impacts of these changes. But one thing that I don't think we've quite seen yet is a comprehensive theory of how the academic publishing system has co-evolved with the rest of digital media, and what that means, what the downstream effects of that are already happening or are going to be happening on mainstream news, on opinion, on policy, on politics as it relates to science and research. And in my view, it's vital that we develop an understanding of that, especially at a time when the value of the scientific enterprise is, putting it lightly, being questioned by folks here in the US and around the world. Also, this panel is an attempt to sort of break down some of the siloization that can happen among press and researchers and academic publishers. It's something that I've seen a lot throughout my career, and I'm really fortunate to have, again, folks who are from all different sides of that. And so we're here to start that conversation. It's not something that we've finished, and it's going to be a little messy. It's going to be unsettled. There's going to be disagreement and some incompleteness. It may even be a little deliberately provocative at times. And our hope is it catalyzes a future conversation on this topic. Okay, so I'm going to go in really quickly to, again, I'm calling it like a speed run on modern open science. The panelists have helped shape this and also may have disagreements with it. So raise your hand at any point if you want to add anything to these points. But I'm going to I don't want you to just have to stare at me for multiple minutes. So I'm going to put together a very brief slideshow. It's like 6 slides to talk about it. Okay, so first question is, what is open science? There's lots of different definitions of it. And I think it's a little distinct from the open science movement, but in general, what we had talked about and what I think is right is it's about centering the idea that the scientific enterprise is a public good that serves society, and that at its best, it should be an open and collaborative effort rather than a closed and competitive race. Not just because it's best for society, but also because sharing information openly makes it easier to spot and correct errors, reproduce results, make progress faster, more equitably reward researchers for their contributions to research rather than their name recognition, and in general, increase the pace of progress. So that's how we're sort of thinking about what open science is, and we'll get into the specifics of how it's practiced in a moment. All right, sounds good. So next, we're going to just walk through how we got here, because I think in a lot of cases, what we're seeing now in the open science movement is a response to the evolution of publishing and funding in mostly the 20th century and, of course, early 21st. So prior to World War II, we had what might be called the informal era of research of science. You think of things like the Explorers Club in New York City, which this is a photo of, where it was these sort of funding was primarily by donors or self-funded, and there were these informal knowledge commons maintained by often learned societies or academic libraries, or sometimes just direct peer-to-peer communication. And there was a concept of review, but it mostly was not peer review as we think about it today. It was mostly editorial boards deciding what they wanted to publish or not, and pretty opaquely at that. So then into World War II and post-World War II, again, this is a speed run. We're leaving so much stuff out, just covering the basics for folks who don't know it. We get into the big science era, or what Nidhi said might be best characterized as the decentralized science era. And so this is the idea that the government is going to fund science, but it's going to do it in a decentralized and undirected way, where it's going to fund it across it's going to fund research institutions across the US. And this was pioneered by this gentleman here, Vannevar Bush, who was heavily involved in research efforts during World War II and then setting up the system afterwards, a system that is under strain today, as I think we all know. And an effect of this system was that the need for evaluation of these government grants at scale led to formalized peer review, generally, skipping about 10,000 steps in a lot of history, but it sort of catalyzed that process. And also it led to the creation and consolidation of publishing activities and dedicated publishing companies that could do this at scale rather than those informal networks that preceded them. So then, I want to talk about what the open science movement is and sort of what's been happening. So should be noted, open science has been talked about for hundreds of years. It's not a new phenomenon. People have long recognized that research is, maybe not science, but open research anyways. People have long recognized that research is a public good and should be shared openly, but those ideas started to be more formalized in the 90s, or 80s and 90s. And there were a bunch of declarations, I'm not going to go into all of them, that talked about what the principles of open research, open science are. And in a lot of ways, I think this is a reaction to increasing consolidation and mostly also increasing profit margins by commercial publishers that led researchers to think that they were no longer in control as much of publishing their work. And in response to this, some folks started creating workarounds. And the main one, or one of the earliest ones, is the creation of arXiv, which is a preprint server, we'll get into that in a second, that largely served the math, physics, and computer science communities, I think launched in 1991. So talking about preprinting, what is it, and how did it go from 1991 to the present? So the basic idea is putting working papers online for feedback prior to formal submission and publication. And again, it was pioneered by the arXiv, but then it spread quite a bit over the ensuing years. And one of the landmarks was in 2013. Richard, along with others, co-founded bioRxiv and medRxiv to serve biology and medicine. And then, there was a nice steady growth, I think, through the 2010s, but then the pandemic, the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020 really accelerated the adoption of life sciences. And we're going to discuss this a lot in depth, but led to a lot of the benefits in research that we saw during the pandemic. So that's that. And then the sort of latest developments, again, very rough, 2020s and beyond, are these ideas about open review and open data. So the idea here, and this is all of us on this panel talk about this a lot in our jobs, but the idea here is that communities could openly publish reviews in journals or just publish reviews of preprints without journals, without the accept and reject decision, and that the benefits of peer review could be achieved without gatekeeping and could be achieved while reducing negative impacts of closed review, like bias and abuse and predatory journalism and some other things like that. And then finally, the open data piece of this is the idea that, well, if we're going to do everything openly, it can't just be the paper. It also has to be the data and the code used to produce the paper so that it can be reproduced and so that people can actually see how the sausage was made. So that is it. That's our speed run through open science. And so I'm going to stop sharing my screen. Any notes or additions before we move on to the question? I mean, I'm sure there are many, but in general, we're happy with that as like, this is what we're talking about. Great. Okay. So as I said, we're starting a conversation today that's going to be a little provocative. And so we have 4 provocations we're going to talk through before we get to your question. And so the first one is that the adoption of open science practices has been net beneficial to the scientific enterprise. Right, and so as examples of that, we look at the pace of COVID-19 vaccine development. We look at studies that show increased citation counts for articles that are published openly or preprinted, and so on. And so the question is, do you think that's true? Why or why not? And I wanted to start with you, Nidhi, because you are a active researcher and you've really adopted open science principles. And I want to start the conversation by saying why, and why did you choose to do that, and what benefits have you seen, and do you agree that it's been net beneficial to your work and the scientific enterprise as a whole?
I would agree that it's been a net benefit to my scientific work as a whole in general. I mean, a major complication when we want to report the science that we perform in my lab is that there can be a dramatic time difference between when we think a study is finished versus when either the field thinks the study is finished or the paper is published demonstrating that that study is finished. And that time can be anywhere from a few months to years. And that the length of time usually correlates with the status of the publication that you're trying to publish your paper in. And so open science, primarily preprints, which is the mode of open science that that my lab practices, is I get to share the science in my lab when I think it's ready. I know that that means that an entire community and an entire field and the reviewers of the papers are also evaluating that. And so I have to be fairly confident about the work that I put out there to be able to respond to the criticism that is bound to come, right? And so for my lab, I see that as a net benefit because getting the information out there faster so that the field can build on it is a priority for me. Quite frankly, I see that as a major tenet of my job as a scientist. I I might not I might say that there are some concerns about open science for science in general, as a net benefit for science in general, just because we know that there are bad actors that are weaponizing open science. We saw that during the COVID era. I mean, and that's not limited to open science. There were people who also weaponized standard peer review and publication in order to put out information that has since been retracted. And so I don't think that's unique to open science. And so I think it requires a level of vigilance and understanding about bad actors, so that we can understand how we can mitigate their effects while taking advantage of the benefits of open science.
So, Risha, I wonder if you could touch on two points that you made. One is, are you seeing network effects happen across, I mean, biology as a whole is too hard to say, but across communities on bioRxiv and medRxiv where, more than just, it's beneficial to more than just one lab? I think that would be a good question for you is, are you starting to see those network effects on bioRxiv and medRxiv? And then I think the second one would be, well, what have you done about the bad actor problem? How are you thinking about that? I mean, it's not your, what have you done? No, you know what I mean? How are you thinking about that?
Yeah, well, I mean, I guess what I would say is there are network work effects, and I think it's important. I mean, I would completely endorse everything that Nidhi was saying, but I think it's important to think about preprints in particular against this backdrop of a cultural change that has been happening in science. I mean, particularly in the kind of the areas of molecular biology and cell biology I'm familiar with. I always describe science, academic science, as it's a prestige economy, which is hyper competitive. It was ever thus, but often lots of these small groups in really quite vicious competition. But what has happened over the past sort of 15 to 20 years is you've seen this shift towards open science, in part because of some of the technologies, in part because of some of the questions that are being asked, like the Human Genome Project. You've some of these big endeavors, which really can't be done in that framework. So there's been, I mean, I remember going to the New York Genome Center, and Tom Maniatis, who's probably, every molecular biologist would know his name as a very old school molecular biologist. And he gave a keynote saying we have to move from the age of competition to collaboration. And so I think you've seen that, and you've seen that in the next generation of scientists. So when we saw adoption of preprints, you had a bunch of people who, I mean, the sort of Needy's generation and younger, who were like, well, this is just obviously the way it should be, which was a contrasting view of the kind of like the boomer generation, who was still kind of bound up in the competition. And so you now get to the point where you have trainees in people like Needy's lab who can't imagine that there was a time when there wasn't something like bioRxiv, which has always been pretty amazing to me. So I think that's the backdrop for it. And that kind of sharing is an important word, and is meaningful. Because there's been a switch from hoarding to sharing, in part because of the nature of the data. And I mean, to your original question about net benefit, I think absolutely it's a net benefit. I mean, there was a great article in PLOS, I think it was a PLOS Medicine, about sort of 20 years ago, talking about the potential for preprints. What if there were a pandemic? And then this happened. I think it was written around the time of SARS-1, when 90% of the papers were published after the outbreak had finished. Then we got when we on bioRxiv, we saw a handful during Zika, and then in COVID we've now had 30,000 papers, more than 30,000 papers. And you saw that, as you said, you saw the a disease that we didn't know anything about, and within a year we have a vaccine. That's unprecedented, and that's because the sequence was available immediately. We started seeing papers in January, February of the structure of spike protein and the molecular biology of the virus, and then you get the clinical trials. So I think all that is pretty inarguable. To the question of the dangers, there are, but I tend to think it was ever thus. I mean, the MMR paper in the Lancet by Andrew Wakefield, that wasn't an open access paper in an open access journal. For many years, the Sunday Times in the UK essentially had an editorial campaign denying that AIDS was caused by HIV, nothing to do with open science. I think there's been a little bit of alarmism in joining the dots between open science and there is this phenomenon. I mean, we could have an entirely separate webinar on the horrors of misinformation and distortion, but I don't think I don't think that's necessarily open science. I think it's an information challenge that is way beyond that.
Yeah, that makes sense. And thinking about that information challenge, I mean, Rachel, you have a background as a scientist yourself, and then have gone into journalism. Has the adoption of open science, particularly preprints or open review, and particularly thinking back to that pandemic moment, has that changed the way that you work at all? And if so, can you give us an example of whether you think about things differently?
Yeah, absolutely. It definitely has changed the way that journalists think about the way we cover research and how we transmit it to the public. And there are benefits and risks, and I'll get into both of those. Probably the biggest benefit of open science when it comes to journalism are more tools that journalists have to sort of leverage the increased transparency and accountability that open science provides. So, for example, with the right reporting and due diligence, we can cover preprints with the right caveats and bring findings to the public sooner, as Needy was saying, much faster than the traditional publication process allows. And other open science practices like protocol registration and open data help us to hold scientists to account and spot things like fraud more easily. So, for example, journalists can keep tabs on how researchers pre-register their endpoints on a platform such as clinicaltrials.gov. Although right now there's a banner that says it's not being fully managed and maintained. But that aside, we can watch those interesting trials as they're being pre-registered and conducted, and then follow up later if something doesn't align in the final published version of that study. And that's a good way to generate questions that we have for experts. But of course, all of these benefits come with the risks that journalism could be circumvented altogether, in which scientists are sharing their work directly with the public, which does have good things. But without the intermediary of a journalist getting outside comment and putting the findings in the context of the broader field, there's some risks for miscommunication that can come up. And we'll get into that more, I'm sure.
Yeah, oh, Richard, go ahead. Oh, you're muted.
Sorry, I just wanted to ask Rachel a question, actually, sort of based on that. I mean, one of the things that occurred to me with preprints in particular was there was a lot of kind of like sort of pearl clutching around the fact that we used to have the Inglefinger rule, which meant that, you know, journalists would be circulated a private copy of the information, and then like a week later when the journal article came out, then everybody's kind of, you know, analysis would come out. And it always struck me as kind of a little bit odd, because like, the rest of journalism doesn't work like that. You know, if there's an earthquake in South America, you don't say, okay, nobody's going to report it. We're going to wait 7 days until everybody's had a chance to talk to a geologist. So do you think it has made science and medical reporting just like the rest of reporting?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And I think the answer is yes, in a lot of ways. I think you're referring to the embargo process, and there are so many flaws with that. There's also sort of an assumed honor system that everybody will abide by a certain journal's embargo policy, which isn't often followed anyway. So it removes that extra barrier of time constraints and honor code, and just allows us to get again, get the science to the public that obviously funded the research, to get it to them much more quickly. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, presumably there's like an echo there of the openness, in that one of the complaints about those embargoes was that, you know, it was great if you were on the list of people that, you know, were getting sent the press release from Nature. So if you work for the Times or something, you're fine. But there's a whole bunch of other journalists who weren't on that list, and wanted to be.
Yeah.
Absolutely. It removes the barriers across the field for sure.
Very cool. So I want to move us on now to our sort of second provocation, because we're actually getting into that. And Rachel, you mentioned this very specifically, you know, what happens when scientists communicate directly to the public, and also, you know, like how much control do journalists have anymore over what people see, and so on. And so the second provocation, and we all touched on this, and let's just dive right into it, is the adoption of open science has not been that beneficial to society's understanding of and trust in science as a whole. So I think we more or less agree it's been beneficial to the scientific enterprise, with, you know, the caveats that Nidhi mentioned. But this is, you know, that it has not been that beneficial to society's understanding of and trust in science. And, you know, for examples of that, we have now retracted preprints promoting ivermectin and vitamin D as you know, COVID treatments. We have the former U.S. Trade Rep Peter Navarro citing debunked lab leak preprints on Zanodo in 2021. We have RFK Jr. misinterpreting preprints and paper mill science in vaccine guidance, on and on and on, that we've seen now. That where it seems like science jumps from, you know, something being posted to these places very quickly with little intervention from experts or professionals. So that's the provocation in question. And Richard, your hand's up, go for it.
Sorry for the reflexive hand raising on that one.
No, all good. Yeah.
I'm sure you saw that coming, Gabe. Yeah, I mean, I think, you know, again, I'm not convinced that it's specific. I do think we have a problem, right? I would admit that, but I don't think it's specific to open science or preprints. I mean, like I said, you know, we've had this with HIV denialism. We've anti-vax existed before people were really using the web. It's the information transfer that's a challenge. You know, I mean, you mentioned ivermectin preprints. There was an infamous one. It wasn't on bioRxiv, I hasten to add, or medRxiv. But there were, you know, if you do a search for ivermectin in PubMed, you'll find a lot of peer-reviewed papers about how effective it is. You know, there are papers about ivermectin, hydroxychloroquine, the infamous paper that said you could catch COVID from 5G towers was in a peer-reviewed journal. So that, I mean, I think all traditional dissemination has a problem here too. I mean, one of the good things about open science and preprints in particular is this possibility for rapid correction. I mean, when I think of possibly, well, I'm not sure I would consider them missteps, but they have been focused on a little bit. As a couple of preprints that we put out, one on some sequence homology to HIV within the SARS-CoV-2 virus, which was incidental, didn't mean anything at all. But there was, there's a big conspiracy theory around that for about 48 hours until the the authors of the preprint withdrew it and explained that they got stuff wrong. We had one with myocarditis rates where there was overestimates of the incidence of myocarditis in response to vaccines in Canada. And what was interesting there was because so many eyes were on the preprint, very, very quickly, people were like, oh, there's something wrong with one of the denominators in the calculation. This is wrong. And that happened within 24 to 48 hours. And again, the thing was withdrawn. And I'm damn sure that if that had gone through formal peer review, that would not have happened. Because actually, I spoke to a cardiologist about this, and he said the important thing was you had to have somebody from that region of Canada to know that the denominator was wrong, and the likelihood of traditional peer review catching that would have been very, very low because they would not have chosen a peer reviewer from that region of Canada. So I think, I mean, I think there really is a problem, but there's also a potential solution there.
Got it. I want to, the thing I want to ask about there is, it's great that the scientific enterprise is self-correcting as we know, and open science is accelerating that. But it's really the impact on the public that you mentioned. Those conspiracy theories are still springing up, whether or not the scientific community corrects it. And so I wanted to ask you about this, Nidhi, a little bit, which is, as you've adopted open science, first of all, have you seen the benefits that Richard just mentioned, from a science perspective, but also, and I think most importantly, your lab is active on Blue Sky and other places. Do you think about the way you communicate with audiences on places where it's not just going to be researchers, and has that impacted the way that you practice science at all?
I don't know if it's impacted the way I practice science. I think it definitely has impacted the way I talk about my science. And I have to be very, very aware of who my audience is when I'm talking about my science. I mean, so one thing that I typically do is every tax day, every April 15th, I thank the American people for paying taxes that fund the federal funding of my research, right? I feel like it's a responsibility that I have to acknowledge. But when I send that, when I was on Twitter and I send that tweet, or when I'm on Blue Sky or Facebook or LinkedIn and I send that piece, of information, I don't talk about the details and the proteins I work on. I talk about the work that I do that allows us to understand, how chromosomes are divided during embryonic development and sexual reproduction, because those are the things that underlie cancer and infertility and miscarriages, right? The language that I'm going to be using is going to be much more accessible based on the audience that I'm talking to. So that's one part of it. And I mean, to your point and to Richard's point, I think one thing that we may have underestimated is how much our conversations about the uncertainty about science that were so clearly demonstrated during COVID-19, right? Conversations about, I mean, and this is how science works. Someone poses a hypothesis, they test that hypothesis is wrong, or that hypothesis is correct, and then they continue to refine that hypothesis. And sometimes their ability to answer that hypothesis is influenced by the way that they choose to do the experiment. And so there are levels of nuance and subtlety and criticism and self-correction that in some ways you got to see happen out in public in a way that maybe, wasn't and was happening with scientists, not just partisans manipulating that for some of the political takes that they wanted to take, right? And so I wonder if what we're seeing with that, with how people are responding to science right now, is a response to that uncertainty. And you sort of see this a little bit with AI, that people really like the power of the certainty of AI. A colleague of mine pointed this out on Blue Sky, and I think it's a powerful point, that that level of certain uncertainty creates insecurity, creates sometimes distrust. And we're seeing that play out socially now because a lot of that was publicly worked out. Even when, preprints are getting pulled back, what does that say about the group that put that preprint out? So, I mean, I think one thing that we may want to understand is that when we practice open science, we're also demonstrating the scientific process and the uncertainty that's a key component of it. And that can be hard for members of societies to see in real time.
Yeah, I think that's an awesome point. And as a lover of uncertainty myself, I think we need to work on training people how to understand that a little bit more, or at least be comfortable with it. I was a joke, I hate uncertainty, and I'm really uncomfortable with it. Richard, I'm serious, I'm gonna go to you in a second, but I did want to ask Rachel actually, if I can, to comment on that a little bit, in particular because your job in some ways is to help people understand that uncertainty, and I'm just wondering how you think about that, and also if you also think increasingly about the impact of your work in less formal spaces, social media and so on, has on people's understanding of that.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we've had to think as journalists, and obviously I'm just one, but trying to speak for the field, to think about that exact question that Needy posed, which is to help our audiences become more comfortable and have greater understanding of the process of science and how it's a human, iterative, self-correcting process. And it's has flaws baked into it because it's an imperfect process. That doesn't mean it shouldn't be trusted. That doesn't mean if a study comes out and says one thing and then another one comes out and says something different, that doesn't mean we throw out everything and just say we don't understand anything. And especially now in the current landscape in the US in particular, it is increasingly on the shoulders of journalists to communicate uncertainty in science as a fact and the nature of science that's baked in, but not as a weakness of science, but it's actually the strength of science. And just to go back a little bit to the idea of how journalists might be adapting to pre-printing, we have sort of an increased responsibility to know and practice the idea of critically evaluating scientific claims that come through in preprints and to communicate those caveats that come through properly with our audience. And so for the first step, at least for a journalist, would be to decide whether a preprint is worth covering at all. Like Richard said earlier on, of course, the entire field of journalism can't cover millions of preprints. And I would argue that not every preprint needs to be covered by a journalist. There are ones that are very small, incremental, very niche findings that would be beneficial to small groups of scientists, but the entire world doesn't necessarily need to know about that. Great, it's up there if they want to find out, but maybe it doesn't necessitate coverage. So questions a journalist might ask themselves are, is this particularly timely or important? So COVID preprints come to mind. Or scaling back, does it move the needle of a field in a very big way? And then a journalist doing proper protocol would then look to chatter in places where scientists gather, like PubPeer or on social media. What is the discussion happening there? Are they majorly discounting the research that has been posted on a preprint server, or are they sort of rallying around it, getting excited? This is a big deal. That would be a signal to a journalist that this might be something you want to cover. And then when it comes to actually reporting on the research, you would want to majorly double down on seeking outside experts' opinions, because you kind of have to perform your own version of peer review as a journalist if you're going to cover a preprint. So instead of asking just a few outside commenters about the quality of the research, you would want to ask many outside commenters. And then in your actual writing of a story on a preprint, you would want to be extremely clear with your audience that it is a preprint, that it's not a published or published paper, that it hasn't undergone traditional peer review. And some of those things can be done with simple word swaps, where I use manuscript instead of paper, or posted instead of published, to make it abundantly clear to your audience what it is that you're covering. And then probably most importantly, and probably the thing that happens the least, would be to update your story later when the research has undergone full peer review and is published in a traditional sense. And especially if there are differences between the preprint and what is the final published version of a paper. And Richard mentioned there's the great benefits of when things are quickly pulled off, if the research community responds and flags all kinds of all kinds of weaknesses. But if a journalist has covered that preprint, or is working on interviews before it's pulled, they may not then turn around and publish an update to the story. Hey, this preprint I covered now has been removed, and here's a follow-up story. Journalists are increasingly strapped for time and resources, and so that's a big potential problem in this sort of cycle, is where a preprint is covered and then not followed up later, if that makes sense.
Oh, that's awesome. Richard, you had your hand raised earlier. Did you want to?
Yeah. I mean, I just to kind of bridge those two comments from Needy and Rachel. I would congratulate Needy. I think one of the things that has happened with open science is it's shone a lens on this gap in understanding. And so the more that scientists are out there I feel like there is an obligation to do this. Getting all this money, it's part of your job. And we see the need for this because, as you said, there's this misunderstanding of uncertainty. The public are notoriously, and actually it's not just the public, it's scientists as well, notoriously bad at understanding relative risk in particular, and correlation and causation. We see things, this is a lot of the basis for worries around autism, because a kid gets loads of injections and then around the same time happens to be when autism manifests, and explaining to people that this isn't causal, explaining what the evidence basis for treatments are. The N=1 study, where you witness something in one person, then, pilot studies, randomized controlled trials, big observational studies. So you get to a point of confidence, and that's increasing confidence. And, we need to communicate that as the uncertainty goes down through that process. And, there were some really amazing examples, even within the medical profession, of people not understanding the evidence basis for claims. And, I think if open science has shone a light on that gap, then that's been a good thing, because it's something we really need to address as a society.
Yeah, thank you for tying those two together. And I think that's a great place to transition to maybe the last topic that we'll cover. So, and then just a reminder, folks, people have been posting great questions in the chat. We're going to stop in 5-ish minutes or so and then get to those questions. A couple of people submitted them beforehand, but you still have time. You can post them in the chat or in the Q&A feature in Zoom, but get them in now, because we've got a lot of good ones. We may not have time for all of them. So going back to the two provocations, we've got the first one was, has open science been net beneficial to the scientific enterprise? The answer is yes, with some caveats. Has open science been net beneficial to society's trust and understanding in science? The answer seems to be, we don't know. It's not just open science, though. There's a bigger misinformation problem that we need to, or not misinformation, there's a bigger information ecosystem problem generally that we all need to start to understand. We've heard perspectives now, from the journalism side, from the researcher side, from the academic publishing side on how to sort of start to think about those. And also, I think Carmen is posting some really good research on a lot of these questions in the chat as well. That's worth looking at. And so the last thing then that I want to talk about, and gets at your question, and it's really a question for all of you, but it gets at the question you posed, Richard, which is in the intro. I talked about this this once distinct academic publishing system and increasingly blending together with mass media, and particularly on social media. Nita, you mentioned, thinking that maybe what we've done, intentionally or not, is shown people the uncertainty, and that's had downstream impacts. And then Richard, you said something that I think was really quite fascinating, which is you think it's part of the job to really do a lot of work to help people understand that uncertainty and understand how science is done. And so I think it begs the question, like, I'm interested in this one, like, yes, in an intellectual answer to it, but also in a sort of like more emotional answer to it as a professional, which is, do you think you are responsible for how non-researcher audiences interpret your work? And that can be tweets, it can be writing, it can be this, this panel. We have audiences here who are probably not journalism or researcher professionals. Yeah, I think it's a question for all of you. Maybe I'll start with you, Nita, because you started to touch on this a little bit. Yeah, what responsibility do you feel for that, and how does it play into how you think about your career and the work you do?
I mean, I'm of two minds of this. I do think it is my responsibility because I think that I need to learn and I need to know how to tailor my communication for the audience that I'm talking to. I'm going to talk very differently to scientists in my field versus scientists not in my field versus people who are not, participating in the scientific research enterprise when I talk about my work. But I would also say that is not specifically what I've been trained to do. And that historically, and when I'm talking historically in the timeline of my training, since, for the last 30 years of being involved in science, it is not clear to me that people who have that skill of bridging, both being able to do the experiments and talk about the experiments in an accessible way that recognizes audience, that responds with empathy, like all of those things that can be a completely different skill set. We have not valued that work. We have not recognized that is an important thing that we should be developing, maybe in our own training programs. And I think you're seeing the consequences of that because we are ceding ground to people who can make those connections, that can talk to audiences that are looking for something bigger than just listen to my expertise, I'm telling you what to do, versus like, let me listen to why you're concerned, and then I will respond to those concerns. And so I think there is definitely some of that is my job, but that is also some of that which is a completely different skill set than I have, and that we should be valuing and training people who demonstrate that skill set so that we have, essentially an information campaign. And I see that, in our training programs and the way that we talk about people coming into our training programs and leaving to become science communicators and not saying in the scientific research enterprise, and making that distinction when I don't think that we should be making that distinction. So, I mean, that's the way I think about it.
That is fascinating. I want to give it to Rachel and then Richard for their thoughts on that, and then we'll wrap up and move on to questions. But Rachel, specifically what comes up in that for me is, this question isn't that applicable to you. Of course, as a journalist, you feel a responsibility for how people interpret your work. That's the whole point of the job. But thinking about Nidhi's comments, do you feel some responsibility for either helping scientists with that process, or for helping the public understand that conundrum that scientists have?
Yeah, I mean, that's an interesting way to put that. I do think that journalists who are doing their job well would, in the context of an interview with a scientist, help that scientist talk about their work in a way that will resonate with the public. So, if I'm in an interview where I'm just getting steamrolled by jargon, I'm not just going to let it happen. I will stop a researcher and just, explain, sort of level set and explain where the audience that I'm writing for is coming from and what level of understanding of their field they might be coming to a story with, and then asking the scientists to speak at that level. And I think that there can be an assumption of sort of a fraught relationship between scientists and journalists, and that's an opportunity to break that down and just explain frankly, look, I'm here to communicate your work, and I'm just as committed to doing that with accuracy and nuance as you are. And the more we can get on the same page about what that looks like, the better for your work, the better for my work, and ultimately the better for public understanding and trust in whatever we're coming out with. Does that answer your question?
Yeah, it does. I really like the idea of it. I mean, this is a bit of a theme, it being more collaborative and open and less of an adversarial process at times. And obviously there are times when, as a journalist, you need to be somewhat adversarial and question things, but I like that approach a lot. And then, so finally, and then we'll get to the questions. Richard, I think the question I would have for you on this topic is, you've talked a lot recently about training and about how we can use open science practices and preprints and review on preprints as a way to train folks. Do you think that it makes sense as part of that, as part of thinking like, well, it's open, people are going to read it, you're going to see it, to do a little bit of what Nidhi's talking about and insert a little bit more of that understanding of the way of the information ecosystem into the training that you've been envisioning?
Yeah, I mean, I think a key point that Needy made is, and I guess I would express it this way. I think it's something that people need to think about. I don't think it necessarily means it's something that they need to do themselves. And that, I mean, there's a reason that there are people like Rachel, because science communication to a lay audience is something that requires professionals. Not everybody could do it. And some scientists, not through lack of motivation, are literally the worst people that you'd ever want to talk about the subject, because their ability to communicate it is almost one of the reasons, So, but everybody can think about the ramifications of it. So, I think that's an important bit. And so, the idea that you can give the elevator pitch is an ideal, but you may not be equipped to do. But you need to think about, what could happen here. And I think scientists have been pretty bad about this historically, and we can do better. And we shouldn't start thinking that, all the problems are of the past because geneticists were bad 80 years ago and they aren't bad now. I mean, these things do happen. So I think you need to think about, I mean, the small way in which we did this, for example, is at medRxiv and bioRxiv. We don't just put up every paper that comes in. We do screen things. And one of the things that we screen on the basis is, what if this were wrong? What could the consequences be? And of course, for 99.99% of papers on bioRxiv, the worst thing that can possibly happen is that a graduate student, wastes 4 months in a lab pursuing something that doesn't work. But if something goes on medRxiv and it stopped people taking their medication, or it stopped people taking, life-saving vaccines, or it made them engage in unsafe sex, that type of thing. So we do, that's where we think, well, it's not our job to solve the problem, but we can say for a small percentage of papers, this shouldn't be a preprint. It should undergo scrutiny through peer review first.
Awesome. Rachel, you want to respond to that, and then we'll go to questions after that.
Yeah, I don't want to take too much time before we get to audience questions, but I do want to sort of circle back to the idea of training that Richard brought up, and that's a really important part within the journalism field as well, because if you think about a lot of the techniques I shared with how a really good journalist would be critically evaluating scientific claims, most of those skills are held primarily by what you would call a science journalist, writing for specialized science outlets or for magazines that are read by science interested people, such as Science Magazine, Science News, Nature, etc., or big outlets with like the New York Times, with science and health desks and entire teams of reporters trained and dedicated to covering science well. But that's not where most Americans, especially, are receiving their daily news. They're looking to their local news outlets and TV stations, a fact that became increasingly clear during COVID. So if you think about it, the reporters at smaller regional outlets are really on the front lines of covering health and science, but they're the least trained to do that job well. In fact, by our calculations at the Open Notebook, fewer than 3% of US reporters and editors have formal training in science, health, or climate reporting. So if you think about it, most journalists aren't trained to critically evaluate scientific evidence. And then we have a really big problem with making sure that the research, especially in the context of open science, making sure that that research that's amplified is high quality. So we need to not just train scientists or science journalists, but we have to train journalists of all stripes to cover science well. And I'd be happy to share more about what we're doing at the Open Notebook to help with that.
Awesome. Thank you. Well, on that note, we're going to move on to all of your questions. There were a couple that came in as part of the sign-up form that I want to touch on. The first one, we got a ton of questions about countering scientific misinformation. And our answer to that one is kind of, well, we're not exactly experts in that, but there are lots of people who are. The Harvard, the Trenton Center and the Harvard Kennedy School have the misinformation review, which talks about that a lot. One of my co-fellows at the Trenton Center, Julia Engwin, just published a report on the future of trustworthy information. And then one of the incoming fellows who I met a couple weeks ago, Dr. Rickarn Martins, studies misinformation intervention. So stay tuned to the Trenton Center in particular for information about that. We're not necessarily the experts, but they have really good ideas and are working on it. So that's one. AI also came up a lot in our in the questions that people asked. What are the implications, and so on. I think for me it's really early and hard to tell what the impacts are going to be yet, particularly on the spread of scientific information. Obviously, we've seen some positive and some negative ones already, but I wanted to see if anyone had just a brief thought on AI. I think I think, Richard, you mentioned it very briefly.
Yeah, I mean, a couple of thoughts. I mean, I think that, I agree it's very, very early on. It's kind of like judging Wikipedia in its early days and complaining that it wasn't right on comprehensive about everything. So we need to wait a little bit. Certainly one, what I'd said in the lead up to this was, we have millions of articles every year. Unfortunately, we can't get Rachel to summarize all of them. For people, but that is one thing that AI is pretty good at doing. I think, there's lots of claims for AI, but the one that I've been pretty convinced of is its ability to rewrite things in a way that can be understood by a non-expert. And it's not great, but it's almost certainly better than, well, I will say this categorically, it's better than 95% of scientists at doing this, probably. Again, because it's a skill and good training sets. One of my worries with it is we already know that when people are going to Google, they're just looking at the AI search results and none of that. So, I mean, I think I worry more about that than I did about everybody going to the adverts now. And I think it appeals to the laziness in us, and that may not be good at getting the most accurate information.
Right. Nidhi, I think you had mentioned that very briefly when you were talking about how, how you think about what people are getting when they see you sharing science, right? That they're getting this big complicated picture, not the little summary that they may want to see. Yeah. Okay, let's move on to one other question from that came in beforehand. This is from Sujitha, and it's, what are the implications of open science for researchers in developing countries? Will they get affordable access to research? This one is a question that gets answered all the time. I think I'll tee up by saying I think the hope of open science is that yes, indeed, it offers more access to research in developing countries because there aren't paywalls that are really expensive and cost prohibitive for folks who come from institutions that aren't the ones we all maybe come from. I think the flip side of that is, of course, we've kind of open science has in some ways flipped the business model a little bit. So now it's access to publication, and that's getting more expensive and harder. And so I do think it's a bit mixed. But with that framing, anyone want to take that on? Any other implications you're seeing or want to highlight? Maybe it looks like you're nodding.
I mean, I just think so. At least anybody who is NIH funded in the United States right now needs to make, as soon as a paper is published, they need to make it publicly accessible, right? And so right now, if you are NIH funded, part of your charge for receiving those federal funds is making a version of your accepted manuscript, a manuscript accepted at a publication, publicly available. I know that there are complications with that. I know that there is some confusion about what that actually means, whether or not that means that you have to pay a journal for it to be open access, or whether you yourself can post the accepted version of your manuscripts on PubMed, which is the search engine that where biomedical research articles are communicated. And so I think I guess I see this as what we have to do. And now we're given institutional and administrative support for that, what might already feel like a responsibility. And so I think of this as just we're progressing forward in a way to make anything that is supposed to be a public good actually public. And so that is going to be good for people in the developed world and in the developing world, so that people can build upon that. I think the question becomes, when there's other sources of funding, what are the criteria for that, for getting that funding? And places like Gates, places like are starting to make preprints mandatory. Right. And so I think what you're seeing here is a move towards a recognition that if you are funding a public good, you need to make that good public.
That makes total sense. And I think that gets back to the, some of the stuff we talked about at the beginning. We've got about 4 minutes before we need to start wrapping it up. So I want to do one more question that came in through the chat, which I think is really kind of 2 questions that came in actually through the chat and Q&A that were really good. Arvin sent in one and Mia sent in the other one. Mia's reads, do we need to teach the general public how to read scientific papers? Journalists often serve as translators, but we see people weaponizing certain studies to advance political goals and promote distrust. Is that realistic or not? And then relatedly, Arvin sort of asked, how do we combat preconceived ideas of people regarding scientific inventions and discoveries, especially in this age of digital and social media? And so, I think those 2 are pretty related, but, maybe pass that one to you to start with, Rachel. Do you see it as part of your job, not just to help people understand the study, but to actually read them? Do we think that's realistic?
I think it depends. I mean, I'm not opposed at all to giving people the tools that they need to read a scientific paper should they be interested in doing that. I would say it may not be super realistic to assume that most of the public is interested and wanting to read a scientific paper. If we are struggling ourselves to get most journalists to feel like that's something that they're capable of doing, then I'm not sure that that's going to then be transferable to the general public. That said, I still think it's important to kind of going back to something we talked about a while ago in this discussion, to make sure that the public understands the process of science. I think that's way more important than getting them to read an individual paper. But if you understand how science works, then I think you can then take that information and apply it into how you interpret an individual study, whether you're reading about it on social media from a scientist's posts or from a journalist's coverage of a certain study. I think if you have a deeper understanding of how science works, then that will inform your understanding.
What a great note, I think, to end us off on. Thank you so much for that. So I think we're maybe gonna hang out here for another couple minutes to answer a few more questions and go over just hang out a little bit, I guess, if folks want to chat and catch up in a more informal way. But we're going to end the official recording and panel now. And so thank you so much, first of all, to my panelists, Rachel, Richard, Needy. This is an awesome conversation, and I hope continues in the future and catalyzes more conversations about, really what I think we got to is how we cope with the fact that a lot of how science is practiced is now just available to anyone right now, and we need strategies across the board to understand the implications of that. So thank you for delving in there with me and helping understand that. I also want to thank, of course, the Journalist Resource and the Shorenstein Center at the Harvard Kennedy School for hosting this and helping put it together. Wouldn't have been possible without them. Thank you so much. I think we're going to turn off the recording and then hang out for a bit for a couple more questions. Really appreciate it. Bye, everybody.